Victorian railways were celebrated as the greatest achievement in human history. They were also quietly poisoning their passengers, driving their workers insane, and running a dedicated train service specifically for transporting class-segregated coffins. Almost none of it made it into the history books. This is what they buried. What you are about to watch is the full dark history of Victorian railways, rebuilt through AI reconstruction from court documents, medical journals, and parliamentary records. Every detail is historically documented. Everything you are about to see is real. Let's go. Before a single mile of track was laid, thousands of ordinary British people had already lost everything. Not to a robbery, not to a war, to a spreadsheet. In 1845, Britain went mad for railways. Newspapers called it the future. Investors called it the opportunity of a lifetime. Parliament called it progress. What it actually was one of the largest financial frauds in British history. Here is how it worked. Railway companies needed an Act of Parliament before they could build a single line. So they hired lobbyists, printed prospectuses full of invented profit figures, and sent them to ordinary people, clerks, widows, retired soldiers, shopkeepers, who paid 10% deposits on shares, backed by numbers that had been simply made up. Between 1845 and 1846, Parliament passed 263 railway acts in a single year. They authorised approximately 9,500 miles of new track. A third of those railways were never built. The bubble burst, share prices collapsed, deposits vanished, companies folded. The men who ran them walked away. Karl Marx called it the Great Railway Swindle. He was not being dramatic. A modern accounting study confirms what contemporaries already suspected. Railway directors deliberately overstated profits using vague depreciation rules, protecting their own holdings, while quietly transferring all risk onto outside investors. By the time ordinary shareholders understood what had happened, there was nothing left to recover. But it gets worse. Every railway route needed parliamentary approval. And Parliament was not interested in which communities actually needed railways. It was interested in which MPs had friends. A modern quantitative analysis of parliamentary voting during Railway Mania found that at least a quarter of all approved lines existed because of log rolling. MPs trading votes to approve each other's preferred routes, regardless of economic merit. These politically protected lines performed significantly worse on the stock market both during the boom and after the crash. Some routes were monuments to elite corruption, not to public need. Look at a map of Victorian Britain's railways today. The branch lines leading nowhere, the redundant curves, the stations built in inexplicably wrong locations. That is not a map of where Britain needed railways. That is a map of who had the best friends in Parliament. And now someone had to actually build it. The men hired to do that were described by contemporary writers as barely human. And what happened to them was treated the same way. They had a name for the men who built the railways, not workers, not labourers, unmen. One Victorian writer described them as creatures with earth in their paws, a permanent underclass who reshaped the entire landscape of Britain and were never allowed to belong to any part of it. They were called navvies, shortened from navigators, men who had dug the canal networks before turning to railways. They moved from project to project across the country, living in temporary camps, owning almost nothing, recorded by almost nobody. And without them, not a single mile of Victorian railway would have existed. The pay was better than anything else available, up to 30 shillings a week, roughly triple the wage of an agricultural labourer. But there were no savings, no permanent address, no legal protections, no rights. The money came in on payday, and it was gone within days, because payday was followed by something the navvies called a randy, a continuous multi-day drinking spree that lasted until the last coin was spent. One eyewitness account from the construction of the London to Birmingham line describes the streets around the works after payday as disfigured by loathsome pools of blood. Men lay dead drunk under the market house. Pigs walked over them. Local authorities called in extra police, sometimes the army. Charles Dickens visited the early railway works cutting through Camden and described what he saw as an earthquake. Houses demolished mid-terrace, streets blocked by mountains of clay, deep pits appearing overnight, the entire familiar world of a neighbourhood physically torn open. For the people living alongside it, the arrival of a railway cutting did not look like progress. It looked like the end of everything they recognised. The navvies lived in shanty towns with no sanitation, no records, and no official existence. Boys as young as 10 worked alongside the men. There were no birth registers kept in these camps, no death registers either, which matters because men died constantly. Tunnel collapses, accidental detonations, rock falls, exact death tolls were never officially counted. The Church of England deployed missionaries into navvy camps specifically to document conditions. One recorded a funeral where the dead man was carried to the nearest churchyard on a wooden plank. The camp had no coffin. The local vicar refused to perform the service because the man had never attended church. The missionary performed it himself, over a shallow grave, dug by fellow navvies who went straight back to work when it was done. Every Victorian viaduct, every famous cutting, every tunnel that exists today, built on anonymous deaths, unrecorded, uncommemorated. And in the cities those railways were heading toward, a different kind of destruction was already underway. The navvies destroyed the countryside to build the railway. In the cities, the railway companies did something worse. They destroyed the people. Victorian railway expansion in London was not routed around residential areas. It was routed through them. Specifically, through the poorest ones, because land in poor districts was cheaper, and because the people living there had no political power to fight back. The mathematics of what followed are staggering. Railway construction in London, primarily through the 1860s, directly evicted an estimated 56,000 people. Not relocated, not rehoused, evicted. Handed a demolition notice and left to find somewhere else in a city that was already running out of room. There was no rehousing strategy, no compensation scheme, no legal obligation to find these families anywhere to go, just a deadline, and then rubble. Agar Town, a working-class settlement that had existed for decades north of London, was erased entirely to make room for Midland Railway warehouses near the new St Pancras station. Field Lane, one of Victorian London's most notorious streets, the real location that inspired Dickens when writing Fagin's Den in Oliver Twist, demolished for Farringdon Road and the Metropolitan Railway. Reformers celebrated. The slums were finally being cleared. What they did not account for was where 56,000 people actually went. They went into the streets that remained, into districts that were already overcrowded, packing them tighter, making sanitation worse, making disease worse, making death rates worse. The railway did not clear the slums, it compressed them, and then it built something new alongside them. Urban historians call these areas disamenity zones, strips of city rendered permanently blighted by railway infrastructure, embankments that blocked light, viaducts that severed streets, constant noise, soot, and vibration that drove out every family that could afford to leave. The families who could not afford to leave were trapped behind walls of iron and smoke. In neighbourhoods the rest of Victorian London quickly learned to avoid. Railway arches, sidings, the land beneath embankments. These became the spaces where destitute families sheltered, where casual labourers slept rough, hidden from respectable Britain by the very infrastructure that had displaced them. The railway needed space. The poor were in the space. The poor were moved. And the places they moved to became the next generation's crisis. But the railway was not finished yet, because it still had to deal with something that no amount of slum clearance could solve: the dead. London had a problem. It was running out of places to put its dead. By the middle of the 19th century, the city's churchyards were not just full, they were overflowing. An American visitor in 1852 noted that the ground around many London churches stood several feet above street level, raised not by landscaping, but by centuries of accumulated human remains compacted underneath. At St. Martin's churchyard, an area roughly the size of a large living room, approximately 14,000 bodies had been interred in just 10 years. At a Methodist vault in New Kent Road, gravediggers reported finding 2,000 coffins stacked directly on top of each other from floor to ceiling. And then it got worse. Parish authorities ordered gravediggers to break open older coffins to make room for new burials. Decomposing remains were shoveled aside, bones removed, thrown into the Thames. This was not a scandal. This was policy. Then the cholera epidemic of 1849 killed approximately 15,000 Londoners in a single outbreak. Bodies needed burying faster than the ground could absorb them. The smell rising from London's churchyards that summer was documented by public health inspectors as a genuine atmospheric hazard to surrounding streets. Parliament needed a solution. And the solution, in the most Victorian way imaginable, was a railway. Brookwood Cemetery was established in Surrey, 23 miles from London. Designed to absorb the city's dead for 150 years. And to transport the bodies there, a dedicated funeral railway was built from a private station near Waterloo. The London Necropolis Railway opened in 1854. The station was purpose-built for the dead. Private waiting rooms that doubled as chapels. A hydraulic lift to raise coffins to platform level. Storage arches beneath the station where bodies were held awaiting their scheduled departure. Every morning, the train left for Brookwood carrying coffins. Now, here is where it becomes extraordinary. The coffins travelled in class-segregated carriages. First class, second class, third class. Mourners were separated the same way. First-class funeral tickets allowed families to choose an exact gravesite. Third class, reserved for paupers buried at parish expense, offered nothing. You were assigned a location. You went where you were told. A contemporary bishop expressed concern in print that without strict separation, the body of some profligate spendthrift might be placed in a conveyance with the body of some respectable member of the church. The Victorians enforced class hierarchy among corpses, and, this final detail, both cemetery stations at Brookwood had licensed bars serving alcohol. Mourners buried their dead, then drank at the graveside station before the train home. This was not considered unusual. This was considered a service. The railway had a system for the dead. For the living, it had something far more dangerous. Early Victorian passenger carriages had no corridors, no connection to the guard once the train was moving, doors that locked from the outside. Whatever happened inside a compartment happened in complete isolation, invisible to everyone else on the train. The Victorians designed the perfect private space, then discovered what some people did with it. July 1864. Thomas Briggs, a 69-year-old city banker, boarded a first-class compartment at Fenchurch Street Station for his usual evening journey home. When the train arrived at Hackney, the compartment was empty. Blood on the seats, his walking stick and bag left behind, a stranger's hat on the floor. Minutes later, railway staff found Briggs lying beside the tracks between Bow and Hackney Wick. Catastrophic head injuries, his gold watch and chain stolen, his cash untouched. Britain's first recorded railway murder. The investigation became a national obsession. The suspect, a German tailor named Franz Müller, had already boarded a ship to New York. Scotland Yard sent detectives by faster steamship, arrested him on arrival, and brought him back to stand trial at the Old Bailey. He was convicted and publicly hanged outside Newgate Prison in front of a crowd of 50,000 people. The case sent a single chilling message through Victorian society. First-class carriages, designed to guarantee the privacy and comfort of respectable men, had become perfect killing chambers. Sealed, silent, invisible from outside. And the threat was not only murder. In 1875, Colonel Valentine Baker, a decorated British Army officer, assaulted 22-year-old Rebecca Dickinson in a first-class compartment on a moving train. She fought him off, forced the door open, and climbed half out of the window, clinging to the outside of a train travelling at speed for 5 miles until other passengers spotted her and pulled the communication cord. Baker was convicted of indecent assault, acquitted of rape, partly because the judge determined she had not screamed loudly enough. He served 1 year in prison and was dismissed from the British Army. He subsequently rebuilt his career as a general commanding the Egyptian army. Emergency communication cords were not legally required in carriages until 1868. Even then, they frequently malfunctioned. The medical establishment responded to women's growing fear of rail travel in the most Victorian way possible. Doctors published formal papers in mainstream medical journals claiming that the speed and vibration of railway travel could physically displace a woman's uterus. This was not fringe science. It was cited in parliamentary debates. The railway had given women independent mobility for the first time in history. A ticket bought alone, a journey taken without a male escort. The establishment responded by constructing a biological argument for why female bodies were simply not designed for it. They could not take the ticket away. So they invented a reason why buying it might destroy you. The threat inside the compartment was real. But outside the window, right now, a man is sitting alone in a small wooden box in complete darkness, responsible for the safe passage of every train on this line. And he has not slept in 14 hours, and he is starting to hear trains that are not there. Victorian signalmen worked shifts of 12 to 18 hours, alone, in isolated signal boxes positioned along the line, sometimes miles from the nearest town, responsible for every train passing through their section. One missed signal, one wrong lever, dozens dead. Parliamentary testimony from the period documented what these conditions produced. Signalmen falling asleep at the lever mid-shift, experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing phantom trains approaching from both directions simultaneously, pulling levers for trains that existed only in their exhausted minds. Then, on the night of the 21st of January, 1876, it stopped being a medical curiosity. Abbots Ripton, Huntingdonshire, a snowstorm, signals frozen in the clear position by packed ice, showing green when they should have shown red. 2 express trains collided in the darkness. A third ran into the wreckage. 13 people dead. The inquiry that followed exposed what railway companies had known for years and done nothing about. Exhausted, sleep-deprived signalmen were not an exception on the Victorian railway network. They were the standard. Hiring more staff cost money. Broken signalmen were cheaper. And it was not only the men operating the railway who were breaking down. The passengers were too. In the 1860s, Victorian psychiatrists began documenting a condition they called railway madness. Sudden, violent episodes of irrational behaviour occurring exclusively while trains were in motion. Passengers who boarded trains calm and composed would begin stripping off clothing, ranting incoherently, or brandishing weapons, then return to complete normality the instant the train stopped, as if their sanity was switching on and off with the engine. Case reports collected by medical historians describe men whose episodes returned with mechanical precision every time the train accelerated and vanished every time it slowed. Doctors debated whether the vibration and sensory overload of high-speed travel was overtaxing the modern brain, whether civilization itself was moving faster than human neurology could manage. The railway companies responded practically. Staff were authorized to refuse travel to passengers displaying obvious signs of insanity, meaning conductors were required to make snap psychiatric assessments on crowded platforms with no training and no guidance. Surgeon John Erik Erikson went further. In 1866, he published a formal medical diagnosis he called railway spine, microscopic damage to the spinal cord caused by the vibration of train travel, producing headaches, memory loss, and personality changes in survivors of even minor accidents. Railway companies immediately hired their own medical experts to argue that every single case was either hysteria or deliberate fraud. The courtroom battles between injured passengers and railway company doctors became the defining medical legal scandal of the 1870s and 1880s. The companies had caused the injuries, then paid doctors to deny they existed. And then there was Charles Dickens. In June 1865, the most famous writer in the English-speaking world was travelling from France when his train hit a broken rail at Staplehurst in Kent. 10 passengers died. His carriage was left hanging over a collapsed bridge above a river. Dickens climbed out, moved between the wreckage helping survivors, held dying passengers, and retrieved the manuscript of Our Mutual Friend before the carriage fell. For the remaining 5 years of his life, he could not board a train without his hands shaking uncontrollably. He avoided rail travel whenever possible. He died on the 5th anniversary of the crash, the 9th of June, 1870. He never publicly connected the crash to his deteriorating health. His private letters said it clearly. The railway was breaking the people who ran it and the people who rode it. But for those wealthy enough to travel first class, there was one more thing it was doing, quietly, continuously, from the very seat they were sitting in. The most expensive seats on the Victorian Railway were upholstered in brilliant green fabric. First-class passengers paid a premium for them. They were also, for the entire duration of every journey, being slowly poisoned by them. The pigment responsible was called Scheele's green. a copper arsenite compound used extensively in Victorian upholstery, curtains, and interior fabrics because it produced a brilliant, stable colour that cheaper dyes simply could not match. A second variant, emerald green, was used for even richer shades in luxury interiors. Both contained arsenic. Here is the mechanism. Victorian railway carriages were unheated and poorly ventilated. British weather meant the fabric was almost permanently damp. When damp fabric containing copper arsenite was exposed to common mould, which grew readily in cold, unventilated spaces, the mould converted the arsenic compounds into arsine gas. Arsine gas is colourless, odourless, and toxic. First-class passengers breathed it for the entire journey without knowing it existed. The cruel irony is precise. The more a passenger paid, the more elaborate the upholstered interior surrounding them. The more elaborate the interior, the more arsenic-laden fabric they were enclosed within. Wealth bought a more efficiently poisoned environment. The same arsenic pigments were used in domestic wallpaper, clothing dyes, and children's toys across Victorian Britain. The railway carriage was simply the most concentrated and enclosed dose available. The chemical industry knew. Debates reached Parliament. The fabric remained in carriages for decades. Rome poured lead into the wine and called it refinement. Victorian Britain wove arsenic into the upholstery and called it luxury. But the poison in the seats was only one instrument of control on the Victorian railway. The other was invisible, and it reached far beyond the carriage. Before railways, the time in Bristol was 10 minutes behind the time in London. That was not an error. That was simply how the sun worked. Railways ended it. And in doing so, handed the ruling class a brand new instrument of control that reached into every working life in Britain. Trains needed timetables. Timetables needed standardized time. And standardized time needed everyone, in every town, in every village, across the entire country, to synchronize their clocks to a single authority. That authority was Greenwich. Railways became time police. The first institution in British history to impose a single, non-negotiable rhythm on the entire population simultaneously. And the Victorian establishment wasted no time turning punctuality into a moral weapon. Newspapers and advice books told Britain that being on time proved honesty, reliability, and good character. Lateness was reframed not as inconvenience, but as evidence of moral weakness, financial unreliability, personal failure. The timetable became the measure of a respectable person. For middle-class professionals, this was manageable. They owned clocks. They could plan. For the working class, it was a trap. The Railway Regulation Act of 1844 forced companies to run at least one cheap daily service, the parliamentary train, charging no more than 1 penny per mile. Companies responded by making these trains as uncomfortable as the law will allow. Bare wooden carriages, departures scheduled at 4 and 5:30 in the morning, stopping at every station regardless of journey time. Missing the last train home meant losing a day's wages or sleeping rough. The railway that was sold to Britain as liberation had a penalty structure, and it hit the poorest passengers hardest. Every single time. Victorian railways connected Britain in ways that genuinely changed human life. They also did something else. They swindled the investors who funded them. They worked the men who built them to anonymous deaths. They evicted 56,000 people with nowhere to go. They transported the dead in class-segregated carriages to a cemetery with a bar. They created sealed compartments where murder and assault became invisible. They drove their signalmen to hallucination and their passengers to madness. They poisoned first-class travellers through the seats they paid a premium to sit in, and they used the timetable as a weapon against everyone who could not afford to be early. All of it was documented in court records, in parliamentary testimony, in medical journals, in the private letters of the most famous writer in the English language. And almost none of it made it into the official version of the story. The official version celebrated the engineering, the speed, the ambition, the triumph of Victorian civilization over distance and time. The people who built it are buried under the viaducts. The people it displaced are in the overcrowding statistics. The women who feared it are in the medical journals, under diagnoses that were never about medicine. This channel exists for one reason: to find the real story underneath the story history usually tells. If this video changed how you see the Victorian era, subscribe. Do not miss what we cover next.